Thank you very much. I just hope I can be as comfortable presenting my own paper as Terry was presenting somebody else's paper in the previous session. If I do that, I will have succeeded. So there are two ways to approach this link between shared societies and economics. And one of these directions one could take is to take shared societies as a moral prescription to offer grounds for and guidance to economic policy making. And that is not the way in which this paper goes, mostly because that was not the direction intended for the whole seminar. But I did still want to say something about that way to go, because I think it's one valid way to approach the issue. And one thing I mentioned in my paper is that it was relatively recent phenomenon that economics became divorced from ethics for most of the time. I mean, in our lifetime, we see it as natural that economics is its own independent science. But that 17th century is more or less the time when that development happened. And before that, economics and ethics were treated as part of the same thing. You know, there was no such separation. So it's in human history terms, I would say it's a relatively recent phenomenon that has happened. So it should that should be shocking to us, not the opposite. No? And so I just wanted to say that. But as I said, the paper focuses on making the link in the opposite direction, which is looking at shared societies and do they improve economic performance, which is also, I think, one of the things that you'll find argued in the shared societies book that you all have received is that actually shared societies and economic improvement are part of a virtuous cycle. And if that is true, you need to prove both things. You need to prove not just that economic societies make sense shared societies make sense for economics, but also that how that economic improvement translates also in more shared societies. You know, you need to show both things. So I think it's this. I think anyway we'll need to engage with both sides of both of these directions. So in my paper, what I do is I try to show some resemblances that I found between the findings made by the working group on the economic rationale of shared societies and the principles, the guiding principles on the economics of shared societies. Resemblances that I found between what's stated there and insight from three schools of economics, three different approaches to economic theory. So as a way to help ground the findings made about shared societies and economics in economic theory, and I guess as a way to also show that we should not be surprised that this is the case. We should not be surprised that shared societies lead to better economic improvement, because there are insights from different economic schools telling us that that is the case. So I'm not intending in the paper to show that there was a specific attempt by the shared societies to draw on those economic schools. That may or may not have happened, but I don't think that's really relevant to the argument I'm trying to make. But I do think that by showing those theoretical groundings, also some thing that will be gained for the further development and turning of shared societies into economic policy prescriptions will be achieved in the sense of helping also understand some of the conditions of applicability of what is said about shared societies, for the implicit assumptions that may be at work. And one thing I do in the paper is I'm more concerned with showing how the statements that are made in the guiding principles and in the economic rationale for shared societies, the how of those principles may be achieving that better economic improvement, rather than engage with discussing the principles as such, which I take for granted. No, I take that as a given. So let me get into, I'll say that the three schools I'm engaging with, I'm drawing connections with are Nerx's approach to economic development, and institutional economics and structuralism. So let me start with Nerx. As you might know, Ragnar Nerx is one of the main representatives of classical development economics alongside Rosenstein, Rodin, and Gunnar Myrdal, and others. And he studied the problem of capital formation in developing economies. And he finds that there is a vicious cycle there. This is a vicious cycle between low income, which you have in those economies. And because you have low income, there is little buying power. And this leads to generally low investment. So because you have low investment, again, that makes it difficult to generate more income. So that's the cycle, he says, it's at work in poor economies. And so the limited size of the domestic market in countries that are at early stages of economic development, he finds is a key constraint to investment, to make investment happen. When he speaks about the limited size of the market, he's not talking about population. You can have a lot of people, still the market be small. If those people are very poor, they don't have income to spend. It's not related to territory either. And he identifies that it is related, he says size of the market has to do with the volume of production. So what productivity you have. Of course, the volume of production leads you back to the intensity of capital. If you have more capital, you'll be able to have arguably a higher volume of production. But if capital is scarce to start with, as we are saying it is in low-income countries, that would not seem to offer any way out of the problem. And he says what happens is that if you try to bring investment into any specific line of production, into any specific sector, the market is so small that that would hamper any incentive to invest because you do not have enough of a market to actually recover the investment through the production generated. And that's where the notion of balanced growth that he developed comes handy. Because he says that's why you cannot do that in one sector alone. You have to do that on a number of sectors at the same time. So these different sectors, by becoming each other's markets, each other's clients, they can generate the incentives that you need in order to have investment happening in a big scale. So what he specifically says is an increase in the production over a wide range of consumables so proportioned as to correspond with the pattern of consumer preferences does create its own demand. So in a way that one specific sector will not create that demand. But if you have this happening across different sectors, then that level of demand will be created. But still that leaves open the question of how we deal with the need to create the capital to enlarge the market size. And here, there's the other notion that I wanted to introduce that he develops, which is the notion of disguised unemployment. So what he calls disguised unemployment is the phenomenon that in countries where you have large populations, you have a surplus of labor. He means by this that the same output that you could get from a smaller number of workers, you are getting from a bigger number of workers. So there is a number of workers there that, of course, you could not say this in real terms, these are they are productive workers, but analytically he says, you have certainly a part of the labor force that is not being productive because one part of the labor force with its production is already doing enough to feed everybody in the workforce. So without a change in the method of production, he says you could actually generate the same, and this is a condition that he finds, that if you can do this without a change in the method of production, you could have the same number of, a smaller number of workers achieving the same level of production, then that means that you have a number of workers there that are like disguised unemployment, or you could call that, he says, that's a disguised saving, no? That's what he says. And you could actually shift that part of the workforce to produce capital goods. So this is the argument that he makes. And so, and he says, in economic literature, this has tended to be neglected, this what he calls the virtual saving that is represented by this part of the workforce. So, and he says it has been neglected because traditional analysis usually looks at population as part of the demand side of development. So in the traditional analysis, you look at the number of people you have and then calculate, at least in his time, the analysis, what they would do is they would look at the number of people in a poor country and they would say, given this number of people, this is the amount of capital you need to put them to work. So it is assumed that they are part of the demand side of production, but he says they actually are part of the supply side of production. You can put some of this labor force to produce capital goods, so they are part of the supply side of capital. So the reason I got into all this explanation about balanced growth and disguised unemployment was to draw some parallelisms to findings, as I mentioned, in the shared societies principles. So if you go, for example, to the findings of the working group, one of the things you find there said is if the humans, that harnessing the skills and strengths and talents of their entire population, shared societies create safe and prosperous communities, which I think resonates very nicely with this idea that the human resources of a society are a source of savings, or can be a source of savings. Further support is provided, I argue, to the link drawn by the working group between societies that offer all individuals, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, language, gender, or other marginalizing traits, the opportunities to put their skills to productive use, thereby fulfilling their productive potential and an improved economic performance. And the working group also tells us that discrimination against sections of society narrows the labor market and underutilizes the capabilities of those excluded, which again, I think it's a bears resemblance to the notion of the disguised unemployment that you may have maybe actually for reasons of discriminatory barriers set in place in a society. I think also the theoretical approach is echoed in the statement that shared societies might create more resources than in turn can finance policies to support a shared society. And this is very important because actually Nerks was looking at this source of savings as an internal source of savings, and he's very distrustful of externally financed development. And he's not against it, but he finds that it will not actually generate the inducements to invest that you need in a specific country. It will be more guided by those who provide the finance externally, whether lenders or donors. And therefore, what he says is you can use that as a complement to this internally funded development, to the strategy of balanced growth. But it cannot be the beginning. You use it at the end when it's already in motion, but you cannot start with that or it's going to fail. So I think this is, again, it resonates with this idea in the principles of shared societies. And the finding that shared societies facilitate inter-community trade and also tap into the economic potential of the whole society is also a statement taken from the working group, which I think echoes this idea of the role of domestic industries becoming each other's clients. Because obviously the possibility for this to happen would not be there if there were barriers for different sectors to trade with each other. No? So there is that connection. I want to also move to the next school I wanted to bring to bear in this analysis, which is institutional economics. Institutional economics, as you may know, emphasizes the role of institutions in the economic performance. It's credited with breaking the so-called capital fundamentalism, so this notion that the development of countries is linked to the increases in capital stock, by saying you can actually find countries that with the same capital stock developed, so there is not really that correlation there. The correlation you have to look at is with the right institutions or the good institutions to make development happen. And institutions, I provide a definition of systematic patterns of shared expectations, taken for granted assumptions, accepted norms and routines of interaction that have robust effects on shaping the motivations and behaviors of sets of interconnected social actors. So the function of institutions is that they set the incentives to develop ideas, even though the institutions themselves are also ideas. And in an institutional economic framework, the way that economic actors organize themselves and respond to incentives in the framework of given institutions becomes key to understanding the economic performance. And the evolution of the institutions becomes itself a factor capable of altering the choice set that the actors in that economy have available to respond to economic challenges. So what I argue approaches institutional economics significantly to the shared societies is one particular extension of that concept of these institutions as ideas, which is what Evans calls the institutionalized ideas that operate at the level of society as a whole. This is administrative norms, legal rules, other governance mechanisms. These are ideas themselves, but they also generate, or fail to generate, the incentives for the production of new ideas of all kinds, and thereby help determine the overall rate of growth. So he uses the expression institutional technologies. So in a way, comparing that to a technology, as any technology, you can use, once you have a technology, you can use it as many times as you want, and what you get is it doesn't get spent once you use it. You can use it infinitely, but the more you use it, the more you generate increasing returns to that technology. So in a way, ideas are like that, he argues, and these ideas that prevail at the level of an overall society are like that too. They can help you, they don't get spent with one use. They actually continue, you can continue and continue using them, and they generate returns. So how can these ideas become important to the economic performance? Well, in two ways. First, because the ideas, depending on what ideas are, right? But the ideas would, in a way, limit the set of choices. It will be a narrower set of choices than that you can conceive in a purely neoclassical framework, because the institutions will actually constrain your set of choices to those that are acceptable to a society in a certain moment. But it is also wider, because the utility function you are looking at will be an expanded utility function, a broadened utility function that is not also the neoclassical utility function. And so I relate that to one of the working group's findings, which is that governments in shared societies encourage participation, are more responsive to people's needs, and are more in contact with their population's priorities. In turn, residents have a sense of belonging and are more likely to support the state and its policies. And there are other statements that I quote. For example, that a shared society is more willing to hold itself accountable, to relate directly to the people, to address social divisions, and productively resolve conflict. And I say that all of these things that characterize a shared society, this sense of belonging, these principles of inclusion, non-discrimination, etc., can be considered part of one institutional technology, one institutional framework that, in a way, once in place, is going to lead to discarding a number of choices that are incompatible with achieving those goals. Even from a purely neoclassical perspective, you may have a number of choices available in a society, but then because you have these patterns of shared expectations that I mentioned before, the shared patterns of expectations that that prevail in a given society, those that function, those results that you could achieve that are not compatible with that, you'll exclude. You'll not go for those. So this is, and on the other hand, the values of shared societies can be part of that broadened utility function that I mentioned. There is a shared expectation that the economic actors are responding not to rational individual profit maximizing goals, but rather to internalized goals that incorporate the values of shared societies. And the economic solutions promoted by the state certainly will also be expected to draw and to reinforce those expectations, including, for example, the involvement of the citizenry in constructive approaches to resolve social conflict without marginalizing any group, that then would become an institutionalized way to approach economic issues. I think there are all these consequences that one could develop further, and I do in the paper. I will not go further in the presentation. But I think it's important to say that a shared society as an institutional framework, the first function that it plays is that it will help us get right the what of the desirable ends of development, which is not to be underestimated. I mean, what are the ends of development? Like we're talking about indicators throughout the day, how we measure progress. So to have a shared vision of what that progress is, understanding that development is a means to that end, not an end in itself, it's the first place where having a shared society as an institutional framework would help, because then that notion that is pursued will be built on a solid base of social support. But I think shared societies also offer another economic dividend as an institutional framework. Because one thing that institutionalism warns us about is that institutions can also grow entrenched, can be locked in spite of their having negative effects, their lack of positive results. So getting out from under bad institutions is likely to be the most difficult part of trying new ones, is what one of the exponents of institutionalist economics tells us. So you may have existing institutions provide differential returns to some portions of society, which consequently have a special interest, a vested interest on the continuing of those institutions. And so I think it becomes crucial for whether a society can progress economically and share the fruits of that progress to identify who are the social agents or what are the political processes with capacity to generate that change. And it is in this regard that I find that shared societies, again, is probably from many different models, the one that has the best chance to actually help that evolution. Simply because it by itself, by its own definition, I think of it as also almost as a meta-institutional framework, in the sense that it, by its definition, is not going to exclude, it's not going to consider a priori that any group has nothing to contribute to that development of new institutions. No? So this process by which a negative institutional framework can become entrenched, in a way, if you're really committed to a shared society, it will be easier, I would argue, to get out of that, because you can actually, all the agents of change will be more or less on an equal footing in terms, so those with the vested interest and those without the vested interest. So you can expect that there are going to be more chances that that's going to evolve in a positive direction over time. So that's what I had to say about institutionalist economics, and I'm getting into the last school that I compared with shared societies, which is structuralism. And as you know, structuralism is a school that was born around the 50s in the Economic Commission for Latin America. A number of intellectuals are representatives of that school, even though not only intellectuals from within ECLAC, now ECLAC, are part of that school. The school is broader. And in fact, you had, after a number of years, you had what is called now neo-structuralism. So you'll find the people who speak about structuralism, as well as the people who study it, they talk about structuralism as having as a main characteristic its dualism. And this is because a key element in its analysis is the observation of duality or heterogeneity in the economy. Okay, I have 5 minutes? Okay. So they find this duality in the international economy with a center and a periphery, fulfilling different functions in an international division of labor that disadvantages the periphery. But it also finds that duality in national economies in the periphery, which they say exhibit enclaves of progress coexisting alongside backward areas. So technical progress, it is argued, where transplanted to peripheral economies results in them becoming disarticulated and dualist, because heterogeneous economic actors coexist in the exports and subsistence sectors, so a gap in the productivity between the two grows. So there is this high productivity of the export-linked sector and the low productivity of the backward sector in the economy that coexist, and over time, if you just had try to incorporate technical progress in that society, is going to that gulf is going to widen. So this idea that
in heterogeneous economic structures, the incorporation of attempts of industrialization techniques, rather than overcoming the backwardness conditions, is going to reinforce it. Another element that is common to structuralist analysis is the deterioration of the terms of trade, and this is probably what most of you will be at first familiar when you hear about structuralism, and I think it's important to mention the idea of the secular loss of value of commodities, and we may discuss if that is true or not, but the analysis at the time was that there is a long-run tendency for the prices of commodity to deteriorate relative to the prices of manufactured goods. Therefore, if you produce commodities, you'll be over time worse off because you need to produce more commodities to buy the same amount of manufactures. Now, these themes, heterogeneity and inequality as a risk to development efforts, I think can also be found in shared societies. For example, this statement that says, at shared societies in which diverse groups and individuals are economically integrated, etc., enjoy higher economic growth than divided societies. I think it's important to say that this recognition that shared society has, that if you have a divided society, attempts at trying to develop are probably going to fail. In fact, in some structuralist accounts, you'll find that the notion of heterogeneity is not just between different sectors, like the sector linked to exports and the backward sectors, but that within each sector also, you have, due to the heterogeneity of the actors, you'd also have different returns and different evolutions, so that this gulf of productivity also grows within different sectors. No? So, which I think it's the phenomenon of marginality that is, shared societies also examines is important there. If you go to principle 7 of the guiding principles, you'll see this idea that the international economic frameworks and the institutions that support them need to be reformed to ensure a fair, equitable, and sustainable international economic order, and encourage appropriate national policies leading to shared societies and greater economic well-being worldwide. So the connection that is drawn between the domestic tendency towards inequality and international trends, and seeing that as part of an interdependent continuum of the same thing, is, I think, also a parallelism that you can draw. And also the principle 8 that says that existing international economic frameworks need to ensure that wealthier countries and vested interests do not benefit at the expense of poorer states and marginalized groups within all states. Other connections can be drawn between aspects that maybe are not so central to structuralist thinking and the economics of shared societies. And I mentioned one of them, the role that limited bargaining power of the working class plays in the deterioration of the terms of trade thesis, even though Prebisch, when he formulated this, and others also have recognized that they were not they were not referring to that as the main reason why you have a deterioration of the terms of trade, but it is one of the reasons at play, and also the hope that structuralism places in the state as a key agent that can correct some of the tendencies described, particularly through the promotion of the industrialization process. You can find in shared societies in the principle 5, national and local economic policies and programs play a major role in creating an inclusive dynamic for all groups. Of course, if you go to the next principle, you find a principle that seems to contradict that other principle, because it says national and local economic policies and programs too often mainly benefit those who are already successful and influential, and as a result reinforce social divisions. But I don't really see that as a contradiction. On the contrary, it's consistent with structuralism, even in that, because structuralism places that hope in the state, but it cannot escape to its own the fact that it was concerned with how power structures in which the process of reform needs to happen can influence that process of reform. So this was part of structuralist assessments. And in a way, it's fair to say that maybe structuralists were not so aware of that as neo-structuralists are. So the possibility that the state may also be captured by elites, this issue was also present there. But I think this sort of ambivalent vision of the state it's something that I would say structuralism shares also with shared societies. No? So that is the third school I wanted to analyze, as I think Clem stole my ending this morning. I wanted to, but I think it's important. It was intended that this makes a contribution to better ground and handle the theoretical foundations for why shared societies make economic sense. And it can also help deepen, I would say, those foundations through study, through having a theoretical framework that even when you come across empirical assessments, one can always go back to the theory, like in any theory, and see where the theory may have gotten it wrong, and keep trying to improve it and make it more accurate. So that's what I end. Thank you.